Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. The Wagner Group has earned its reputation of reckless murderers who violate every single rule of international law and commit any war crime possible, all the time in the name of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and the Wagner head, Yevgeny Prigozhin. They have been deployed in Syria, Libya, in Central African Republic, and of course in Ukraine. But after Prigozhin's mysterious death in the skies between Petersburg and Moscow, Russia, Wagner Group has lost title pages in the world media and is not appearing there anymore. Has Wagner Group disappeared or just been rebranded? We are talking today to Christopher Faulkner, PhD, who is an assistant professor focusing on national security affairs who works at the US Naval War College. And a disclaimer, in this interview, Professor Faulkner speaks in his private capacity and does not represent the US government or any official institution. Welcome, Professor Faulkner.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you so much that you have found time for this interview. And the first question, is Wagner Group existing anymore after that spectacular mutiny attempt with march to Moscow, then Prigozhin's death, relocation of Wagner to Belarus, rebranding, etc.? Do they have their potential as they used to have?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that it's hard to look at the organization in the same way that it was prior to Prigozhin's death as a homogenous being. It's changed since his assassination in ways that have morphed the organization away from your more prototypical state private military company run by the nefarious oligarch. And I say that because it's different depending upon where Wagner is operating. Most have heard or are likely familiar with the effort by the Kremlin to kind of commandeer the Wagner outfit and, more or less take it over and fold it into the Ministry of Defense in some form or fashion. And that has certainly taken place in places like Syria and Libya and to a degree in Mali. But in places like the Central African Republic, we've seen the Wagner brand and Wagner's legacy personnel still persist. It's been a little bit more difficult to kind of commandeer that outfit. So that's all to say, in some ways, yes, and in most ways, no. And I think that as we get further and further away from the assassination of Yevgeny Prigozhin, we'll see a more concerted and stronger effort by the Kremlin to stomp out the last vestiges of the Wagner Group.
That is not the first time when Wagner Group undergoes certain transformation. Wagner Group was created first as a sort of elite troop of former representatives of Russian airborne troops, GRU Spetsnaz, and other units with high reputation, and were operating under the command of Russian GRU, of Russian military intelligence, a broad, pretty small troop, but highly efficient. And then in Ukraine, they have undergone a certain rebranding. They started to hire Russian inmates massively. They started to hire people without any military experience, just based on their readiness to blindly follow any order and to kill Ukrainians. And after the Rostov mutiny, we have seen the next transformation of the Wagner Group. What kind of fighting capacity do they have now? You have already mentioned that some Wagnerites have been transferred to the army, some have disappeared. How strong they are?
Yeah, I think that, again, going back, it's probably distinct based on where they're operating. So I think of it less as a homogenous organization that really has a fighting capacity or capability that is the same in Central African Republic as it is in Mali. I would say that it's been downgraded substantially, and I think that started in Ukraine, mostly because they relied on non-professional soldiers, prison recruits, convicts to kind of augment their force, and that really created in kind of a what's the word I'm looking for? Dissolution of subject matter expertise, if you will. So they're no longer the elite of the elite or former elite kind of special operators that they might have had prior to the Ukraine conflict. And so that's all to say, I think that force size and somewhere like Central African Republic, you still have the legacy of Wagner personnel who are capable as kind of presidential security, and maybe proficient in counterinsurgency, counterterrorism operations, given their legacy deployment to somewhere like Central African Republic. But in other theaters, I think it's evolved a little bit to where we're starting to see kind of a merging of GRU assets, MOD assets, and Wagner's legacy personnel who have basically been forced to sign a contract with the government or to vacate, to leave the country. And so I think they're still generally a capable force, but I think that there's been significant attrition when it comes to their size, scope, and scale. A, because of the war in Ukraine, and B, because of maybe a little bit of the reluctance to have Wagner's legacy personnel be folded into state institutions more formally. And so I think generally speaking, we've just got a watered down version of what was seen as a kind of premier private military and security company. Now that may change over time and space. The Russian government has clearly signaled an interest in continuing something akin to the Wagner organization, particularly in Africa with the Africa Corps. They've fallen well short of recruitment numbers that they were trying to achieve. Something like 40,000 is what they wanted. I think it got snapped back to reality to request for 20,000. And then from my understanding, it's been even less. And when we think about how many personnel are in some of these locations where Wagner was operating prior to Prigozhin's mutiny, we're talking about maybe 6,000 to 8,000 people across all of their African deployments. And so from just a sheer manpower component, it's not a large force. But that all can change. I suspect it won't in the immediate because of the war in Ukraine. But long answer to your direct question. I think that it's kind of atrophied in terms of its capabilities.
You have already mentioned the African involvement of the Wagner Group, and they have started to fight for interests of Russia there even before they have been deployed to Ukraine, and they continue to fight there. It seems that they feel in Africa in a much more understandable environment and operate much freer than compared to Ukraine. What are their current deployments there, and what is about their relations to local pro-Russian governments?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if we could just kind of start with North Africa, they've been present in Libya, one of their earliest deployments, and they worked really alongside the Russian military, kind of hand in glove. They deployed to Sudan, more in kind of a criminal enterprise economic exploitation model than really kind of a traditional hard power military model. The two that I'm most intimately familiar with are the Central African Republic and Mali, where we're looking at Wagner personnel now under the banner of Africa Corps serving kind of Praetorian Guard and presidential security specialist and ensuring kind of regime survival for a lot of these coup governments or military juntas, and then offering some degree of counterinsurgency operations to the point where, it's hard to speak in uniformity that they're the same in all of these different theaters. But one of the things that they've clearly signaled is they're willing to fight alongside African militaries in ways that Western partners may have been more reluctant to do for a whole host of reasons. But I think that really sells with the military juntas that have contracted them. And I think it sells with the rank and file to some degree that you've got security force assistance providers who are willing to get in the fight.
You have already mentioned this sort of service as a Praetorian Guard for dictators and authoritarian leaders who are friendly to Vladimir Putin. That seems to be like a sort of payment for the loyalty of this government to Russia. Like, you continue being loyal to us and we will ensure your political survival. But what we read about the deployment of Wagner in these countries, they also look to have their own economic interests there. They want to control gold mines. There are multiple reports that Wagnerites not only exploit local population but also terrorize them, like executing mine workers who refuse to work for them. What kind of weird economy is it? Like, are they looking for some sort of independent money sources for their activity?
It's kind of an evolutionary story. So, back when Prigozhin was heading up this organization, I think it's well understood that he was a kind of a criminal mastermind who had developed a intricate network of shell companies, corporations, all housed under this broader Concord management structure that would then be able to siphon resources off of different governments in exchange for security. And that was really a attractive business model for the criminal enterprise that was the Prigozhin network. That's to say it wasn't the same in all the places that we're talking about. In Sudan, there was much more of a, I think, Russian government hand in helping facilitate the transit of gold. Central African Republic, for instance, it's been far more Wagner shell companies, so Prigozhin entities that have been stood up to kind of participate in this state capture, getting involved in the timber and the gold and the diamond kind of trade, and being used to kind of evade sanctions and smuggle precious gems and timber out of the country. And in Mali, it's found a more difficult environment to try to capture the lucrative, mining industry because of legacy multinational corporations that have significant investments within, pretty extensive, large-scale mining projects. And so, to your point there, I think that was the model for Prigozhin. And I don't know that the Russian state has effectively figured out how to capture that economic portfolio that was the Prigozhin enterprise. I think the idea was we have an opportunity here to exploit for the state of Russia, but also it's to buy off for an oligarch to kind of enrich themselves. And the Russian government's maybe been a little less successful at the economic capture. But the idea here is, I think that it's a little bit, and I'll steal this from a colleague or a individual I shared a panel with not long ago, John Lechner, who's written a lot about the Wagner Group. It's maybe a little bit overblown, the degree to which they were successful in extorting and exploiting the economic interest of their client states. Central African Republic is clearly the case where they were most successful. But some of the numbers that have been thrown around are maybe a little bit inflated. And it's unclear to the degree, like what the cut is, how much was going to Prigozhin entities versus how much was then taxed, in other words, by the Russian state. It's not to say that it was insignificant, but I think that it's just important to kind of suggest that it's by no means a sufficient amount to kind of dampen the effect of economic sanctions across the Russian regime writ large from its time in Ukraine. And then for your last point about how they're exploiting, civilians within these places, I think that there's some credible evidence that, like the Wagner Group had controlled a artisanal mine site in Mali for a short period of time and essentially taxed locals to go in and mine, and then maybe even became the only buyer of the gold that was coming out, so paid the price that they were willing to pay. So there's like an extortion component. And I think that same model has happened in the Central African Republic, but I think there's limits to the durability of those types of extortion campaigns, particularly in Mali, where those aren't the projects that are generating significant sums of money. And so for Wagner's interest, it's a little bit more limited to exploit these artisanal mining sites. I think the long-term goal was to get involved in industrial scale mining projects that has been less successful in that particular location and maybe more successful in a place like Central African Republic.
That sounds absolutely 19th century, if not 18th century colonialism, like installing a private company which kills civilians, which exploits them, which has direct connections to a sort of a puppet local government in order to keep them in power and to exploit the country. We have also seen in 2021 a report of the United Nations where the United Nations institution which has significant influence from Russia, still they had to mention that local experts in the Central African Republic claimed that the Wagnerites officers and soldiers used rape on the local population as a day-by-day tool to force them to do whatever they wanted to do, or to punish them, or to provide their soldiers with additional benefits of being able to rape the local population as a part of their payment. And that was in the UN report. So how does it fit into this image of Russia as an anti-colonialist power who fights against the evil West in order to promote self-determination of the nations, when the Russian state practically controlled private company does all these things?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think you're highlighting the clear irony in rhetoric versus reality. What you're ultimately saying is Russia trying to ride sovereignty waves across places like Central African Republic, Sudan, Mali in particular, Burkina Faso and Niger, since they've got deployments for the new Africa Corps, and Russia promoting itself as a anti-colonial power. In other words, we weren't part of the colonial scramble for Africa. We were very pro-independence in the in the decolonization era. We supported several of these governments. Mali, for instance, like close relations with the Soviet Union dating back to its independence in the 60s. And subsequently, they can frame this narrative as we weren't the French, the British. We are kind of a new international player that is looking to revitalize, what we were in the Cold War period, and provide a security and economic alternative to your partners that have been neo-colonial and exploitative. Now, I think that, suggesting that these military juntas that have contracted Wagner aren't aware of that kind of irony is maybe a little disingenuous from, I don't want to come off like saying they're not paying attention to the fact that Russia says one thing, but their efforts to engage in economic exploitation and state capture says otherwise. I think they're quite aware of it. I think the thing is you're looking at a place like Burkina Faso or Mali or Niger. All countries would have recently partnered with either the Wagner Group or its successor organization, the Africa Corps, and they're doing their best to box the Africa Corps Wagner personnel out of their kind of neo-colonial tendencies. All right, to ensure that they retain agency over their natural resources in ways that combats the neo-colonial efforts by the Russian state. And so I think that's the one part that is important to kind of frame here is Russia can say all they want about they're being anti-colonial, when in reality they're neo-colonial. And I think the African regimes that have partnered with Moscow are paying attention to that and doing their best to create barriers that will inhibit Moscow's success, if that makes sense.
We have seen recently some hits which the Wagner Group has suffered in Africa. And one of them was several attacks by the Tuareg rebels, who have practically decimated some Wagner units. And we have seen videos with the imprisoned Wagnerites. We have seen videos with destroyed armored vehicles. And there came rumors once again that the Ukrainian GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence under General Budanov, was involved into this anti-Wagnerite operation, and we have already seen before similar news. Is it true that the Ukrainian military intelligence hunts Wagnerites in Africa?
Yeah, I think that maybe my to best of my knowledge, one of the first reportings of Ukrainian involvement in kind of the special operations space was coming from Sudan, in which they were providing some type of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance to support targeted assassinations against Wagner personnel. And I don't know that I found any clear, firm evidence to suggest otherwise, or to suggest that that was actually the case. So I can't really confirm or deny that that was ongoing. And I think the issue that you're alluding to now is the attack in northern Mali on the Algerian border, in which a Ukrainian spokesperson kind of alluded to the fact that the Tuareg rebels, separatists there, had some intelligence that gave them a leg up on the Malian army and Wagner convoy that was coming through there. I don't have good intel to suggest that's true or not. And so I'm hesitant to say that, yes, that was legitimate, or no, it wasn't. I think that the thing is we're talking about kind of a space where ambiguity is the strategy, neither confirm nor deny. And what, in some ways, it signals to Moscow, for instance, that, hey, we know where your private military assets are, and we can get to them in creative ways. In other ways, it's a very risky and dangerous kind of proposition to say, I'm going to support a separatist organization or a non-state armed group outside of inside of a different theater against personnel that Moscow prefers to claim don't exist, like Wagner personnel or Africa Corps personnel, and that can have blowback when it comes to diplomatic relations with some of these African regimes. And I think that's what we saw transpire. So it's a really great question. I wish I had more firm answer on whether or not they're involved there. I guess the general point is I can see the pros of why it would be advantageous to provide that kind of intelligence to, if nothing else, to signal to Moscow that you have this capability. But I can also see a ton of negative cons that come with it as well. And I think Ukraine's come out and said, this is a misinterpretation. Yes, the spokesperson said this, but no, this wasn't actually ongoing, to try to stop the diplomatic retrenchment from Mali and Niger, which have both now broken diplomatic relations with Ukraine. But yeah, I'd just be speculating to suggest that I know one way or the other.
But maybe it's also a signal for these governments that Russia is not as strong as Russia wants them to believe it is.
I don't mean to interrupt you there. I do think that that's probably, I appreciate you bringing that up, because that's the one part that I think this particular Wagner defeat in late July in northern Mali illustrates, is kind of the limits of Wagner/Africa Corps' counterinsurgency and counterterrorism capacity. They were able to kind of lean on success in Mali, for instance, in November of 2023, where they helped the government retake a strategic city of Kidal, which had been run by the Tuaregs for almost a decade at that point. And that was really meaningful and kind of signaled to not only the Malian government, but I think Burkina Faso and Niger and maybe the world that, hey, maybe Wagner and Africa Corps are more capable than we think. And I think this most recent clash in northern Mali is indicative of the real capacity of someone like the Wagner Group /Africa Corps, that they have limits to what they can and can't do in terms of reclaiming territory and assisting these military governments.
This looks to be a sort of a pattern which Wagner Group follows since years. Remember, they were, as you have mentioned before, like being formed out of the ex-operators of Russian special forces. They were pretty capable in different countries, and they came to Ukraine. And they said, okay, we can take Bakhmut, we can take this side, we can take Solidar, we can be better than the Russian army, we can beat everyone, which actually not always was true. We know how much of the Wagnerites were killed during the assault on Bakhmut, like more than, I think more than 10 or even 15,000. And that is not the price you pay for capturing a small city. But then they just moved out of Ukraine and created the new myth. We are unbeatable African Corps. We can do whatever we want. Is it some sort of a strategy of hopping from one war theater to another, looking for areas where they can gain a lot of success and prove themselves to be unbeatable, create their image of some special organization? Will they appear somewhere else, for example, in Venezuela, trying to protect the Venezuelan regime?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like the post-2022 invasion when the Wagner was called back to assist. I think almost has to be looked at in kind of a vacuum because this was a very different mission set than I think the organization had been participating in places like Syria, Libya, Central African Republic, and Mali, even for a time in Mozambique. And what we ultimately see there is an organization that's recalled to basically be kind of a Band-Aid on a very, very poorly calculated invasion. And it was just a reserve force that could kind of stop the bleeding and give the Ministry of Defense time to recalibrate. And I think that's what they served their purpose there. and then were clearly over interpreted their relevancy to the conflict with the march to Moscow and Prigozhin's kind of antics that led to his demise. But in these other places, I think that they were seen as a cheap tool to be used to export, Russian foreign policy via the barrel of a gun. We can provide this, and hey, this is beneficial geopolitically for Russia. To your point earlier, it's beneficial at international institutions. We've courted a bunch of different like-minded regimes. We provide them the security. They then vote for or against resolutions that critique Russia's invasion. So in other words, we're building out our Rolodex of allies, and I think that that's where their sweet spot was. And so looking at future operations, I think the Venezuela case it's difficult for me to, it's a little outside of my regional expertise, but I think that, to the degree that there were any Wagner personnel / Africa Corps, or whatever we call them in Latin America and South America, I think it's a limited footprint, maybe more advisory, maybe training, maybe just personnel security. But I don't know that I've seen any significant deployment. But it's certainly not to say that the Kremlin won't try to figure out a way to recreate the Wagner model, to use it to deploy to different theaters that it finds attractive geopolitically or economically. And I really think the important point is we start looking at maybe the Sahel as a model, Sahel region of Africa. Democratic retrenchment is valuable to the Kremlin. And so anything that they can do in terms of offering security assistance to regimes that are running away from democracy is a value proposition that's too attractive to turn away from. And they've been able to do that generally at a low cost with this kind of Africa Corps. And I think that they will hope to replicate that model elsewhere. I can't think of all the countries off the top of my head where it might make sense, but I guarantee that that's something that is on the kind of agenda for figuring out how they scale up and deploy this force moving forward. And then maybe the last thing I'll add about it is I do think that we have this looming issue. I call it an issue, but this travesty of the war in Ukraine that is, ongoing. It's been ongoing for 3 years, or coming up on 3 years, if I'm not mistaken. And so when we start thinking about this conflict, I often think of a counterfactual world. Like if this wasn't ongoing, how would Wagner look? How much would it have grown? How hard was it to combat? And I do think that Moscow, regardless of how the war unfolds and concludes, is going to look to reconstitute something akin to the Wagner brand, with maybe a shorter leash and more direct control. But I do think that there's an element where they'll try to increase the plausible deniability element that made them so effective and successful in the first place, and gave them a ton of agility in foreign policy. That's a long-winded answer, but yeah, wherever they can find opportunity is, I think, where they'll deploy.
And that is exactly what Russia tried to do many times, but has never gone this way until the end. They have tried to create additional private war companies, so-called private war companies, like the Fakel or the Redoute, or some battalions like Rusich, which are, of course, a part of Russian army, but are still being operated more like a separate brand under the personal leadership of a neo-Nazi Milchakov and other units. Like we see that Russia always tries to use this model, but none of these organizations gained that much scale as Wagner. And even Russian corporations like Gazprom or Roscosmos, which try to copy-paste Wagner model, were not that successful in it. But will Russia try to increase the number of these corporations or private military companies, or will it be on the same scale as we see now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had a crystal ball to predict. I think there's advantages to the divide and conquer. In other words, not allowing one of these organizations to become so big and powerful, or at least or self-important, that it becomes a threat to the regime. I do think that there are caveats to that, because I don't think that Wagner was a legitimate threat to the regime, or would have never been a legitimate threat to the regime had Putin not decided to invade Ukraine in February of 2022. But there's an element of me that says, yes, I think the smaller, agile, private military companies that you've kind of outlined the continuum or the spectrum of them there will continue to persist for the foreseeable future in ways that allow the Russian state to have multiple pathways to recruitment. I think that's one of the value adds that these types of organizations do offer is, hey, we're able to use them as kind of shadowy recruitment mechanisms so that we're not just recruiting through the Ministry of Defense directly. And so these fragments are useful for that mechanism for the government. And then on the other side of it, it's clear from their planning that Africa Corps, as I mentioned earlier, is supposed to be a much more robust kind of entity. Larger, well-resourced, really kind of serving at the behest of the Kremlin, folded under the Ministry of Defense through the GRU and providing a plethora of services to client states. And I think that entity seems to have had, if nothing else, a little bit of effectiveness in getting some folks to sign on to a dotted line with the Kremlin, like Burkina Faso and Niger. But as the war in Ukraine continues to loom on, I don't know how they're going to staff it effectively and if they're willing to devote resources to it. So I guess that's all to say. I guess it just depends how the war unfolds to how they might reconstitute and reconfigure their private military and security kind of outfits. But the small scale ones seem to be the direction that they're going in the short term.
And overall, it fits perfectly to the tradition of the modern Russian state to act against international law, but to fully deny it. To deny it even when the evidences are being brought and put on the table. Until the end, they deny their activities or their aggressions or their crimes and hope that they will be able to get unpunished. And that is obviously what is happening with the so-called private military companies in Russia, which are, of course, under full control of the Russian state. This was an interview with Christopher Faulkner, PhD, who is an assistant professor focusing on national security affairs, who works at the U.S. Naval War College. And in this interview, Professor Faulkner has spoken in his private capacity and did not represent the U.S. government or any other official institution. Don't forget to like, to share, and to subscribe to this channel so you will never miss interviews like this. And thank you, Professor Faulkner, for your insights.
Hey, thank you for having me.